Today, we're diving into something that I think is going to reframe how you think about American politics. And I mean, really reframe it. Because what we've been taught about how our government works and how it actually works are two very different things. So let's start with a question. When you think about how America is governed, what comes to mind? The White House, probably. Congress, the Supreme Court, elections, laws getting passed, the machinery you learned about in high school civics class. And all of that is real. It exists. But here's the thing. It's only part of the story, and maybe not even the most important part. To really understand how decisions get made in this country, how policies get shaped, how resources get distributed, you need to understand the difference between government and power. And that difference is massive. Think of it this way. Government is the structure. Power is the function. Government is what exists on paper. Power is what exists in practice. Government is the vehicle, but power is who's driving, where they're going, and who decided the destination in the first place. Sometimes these things align, often they don't. And that gap between them explains so much of the frustration Americans feel about democracy. That feeling that you vote, nothing changes, that you contact your representatives and policy goes the other way. That the system is supposed to be democratic, but somehow policy after policy passes over public opposition. So today we're going to explore that gap. And I want to start with a metaphor that I think makes this really clear. The United States Constitution describes a system of government, right? It establishes three branches with defined powers and limitations. It reserves certain powers to states. It protects certain rights. It describes procedures for making laws, appointing officials, amending the document itself. This is the blueprint. It tells you what the building is supposed to look like. But if you actually walked into the building of American governance in 2026, you would find something quite different from the blueprint. You would find rooms the architects never drew, walls that have been knocked down or built up, parts of the building that are never used, and other parts that house way more activity than the blueprint ever anticipated. You would find people operating machinery the founders never imagined and making decisions through processes the Constitution never mentions. Now, this doesn't mean the Constitution is irrelevant. The blueprint still matters. It still constrains what's possible and provides a shared reference point for legitimacy. But the gap between blueprint and building, that's where power operates most freely. Let me give you a concrete example. The Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. On paper, this is crystal clear. In practice, the United States has been in a state of permanent war for over 2 decades without any formal declaration by Congress. Presidents from both parties have ordered military action based on vague authorizations from the early 2000s, reinterpreted to justify operations the original authorizers never imagined. Congress could reassert its constitutional authority. It chooses not to. The formal structure says one thing, power operates another way. And this pattern repeats across issue after issue. The Constitution describes one system, power has built another one. Sometimes working within the constitutional framework, sometimes working around it, sometimes ignoring it entirely while paying lip service to its principles. Political scientists have these two Latin phrases they use to describe this gap. De jure, meaning according to law or formally, and de facto, meaning in fact or in practice. Let me run through some examples because this is where it gets really interesting. De jure, Congress makes the laws. De facto, lobbyists often write the actual legislative text, and Congress votes on language they did not write and, in many cases, have not even read. De jure, the president executes the laws. De facto, federal agencies make most of the actual rules that govern daily life, and the president's control over these agencies varies wildly depending on the issue, the agency culture, and how much attention the White House is paying. De jure, courts interpret laws. De facto, courts often make law through their interpretations, and which cases they choose to hear or ignore is itself a form of policymaking. De jure, states have reserved powers. De facto, federal power has expanded into nearly every policy domain, while some policy areas have been deliberately left to states precisely because that fragmentation prevents coordinated national action. And here's a big one. De jure, people elect representatives who represent their interests. De facto, campaign finance means representatives spend more time with donors than constituents, and the correlation between public preferences and policy outcomes is weak to non-existent on many issues. Understanding American governance requires holding both systems in mind simultaneously. You need to know the de jure system because that's the language of legitimacy and the framework for legal challenges, but you need to understand the de facto system because that's how things actually work. People get confused, frustrated, and cynical when they understand only the de jure system and keep running into the de facto system without recognizing it for what it is. They wonder why voting doesn't produce expected results. They wonder why clear public majorities don't translate into policy. The answer is usually that they're looking at the formal system while power operates through the informal one. They wonder why the same problems persist, no matter which party is in control. So let me describe how this shadow system actually works, because that's what it is, a shadow system. Think of American governance as two overlapping systems. The formal system is visible, documented, taught in schools. The shadow system is less visible, but often more powerful. The formal system operates through official channels. Bills are introduced, committees hold hearings, votes are taken, results are published. This process is visible and follows documented procedures. The shadow system operates through informal channels. Donors signal preferences, lobbyists draft language, think tanks provide intellectual cover, media shapes narratives, party leaders decide what gets a vote. Agencies choose how aggressively to enforce. This process is less visible and follows unwritten rules. Most consequential decisions involve both systems. A bill passes through the formal legislative process, but the shadow system determined what was in the bill, whether it would get a vote, how it would be amended, and how it will be implemented. Let me give you a detailed example, the 2017 tax legislation. The formal story is straightforward. Republicans control Congress and the White House. They wanted to cut taxes, they drafted legislation, they held some hearings, they used a parliamentary procedure called reconciliation to pass it with a simple majority. The president signed it. The formal process worked exactly as the Constitution describes. But the shadow system tells a more complete story. Lobbyists for corporations and wealthy individuals had been pushing for these specific tax provisions for years. Think tanks funded by billionaires had produced research arguing these cuts would boost economic growth. Donors made it clear to Republican members that passing this legislation was a condition for continued campaign support. Key provisions directly benefited specific donors and industries that had pushed for them. The bill was written largely by lobbyists and passed through Congress so quickly that legislators voted on a bill that had handwritten margins and last-minute changes. After passage, the same donors who had demanded the legislation funded campaigns to defend it against repeal efforts. The formal system says Congress passed a tax bill. The shadow system shows that donors ordered a product, lobbyists designed it, think tanks marketed it, Congress manufactured it, and the same donors who ordered it then protected it. Congress had authority, but power operated elsewhere. Now, this is not a partisan point. The same dynamic occurs regardless of which party controls government. During the Obama administration, the Affordable Care Act went through extensive formal legislative process, but the shadow system shaped crucial decisions. The pharmaceutical industry extracted a promise that the government would not negotiate drug prices. The insurance industry ensured the bill created a mandate to buy their product. Progressive priorities, like a public option, were abandoned to appease conservative Democrats whose campaigns depended on healthcare industry donations. The formal process in both cases was legitimate under constitutional rules, but understanding only the formal process gives you an incomplete and misleading picture of how decisions actually got made. There are specific places where the gap between formal authority and real power becomes especially obvious. Let me walk you through a few. One is the bureaucracy. The Constitution says very little about federal agencies. The founders didn't envision the EPA, the FDA, the FCC, the Department of Education, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or the dozens of other agencies that make most of the rules governing daily life. These agencies are part of the executive branch in theory, meaning the president controls them. In practice, agency culture, career staff, statutory mandates, congressional oversight, industry pressure, and court decisions all shape agency behavior as much or more than presidential preferences. When a new president takes office promising to radically change policy, career agency staff can slow walk implementation, create procedural obstacles, leak unfavorable information, or simply outlast political appointees through institutional patience. This is sometimes called the deep state by those frustrated with it. But it's more accurately understood as the difference between formal authority, the president orders a change, and actual power, the ability to make that change happen. The reverse is also true. Industries that agencies are supposed to regulate often capture the agencies through a revolving door of personnel, through funding friendly research, through building relationships with career staff. The formal authority rests with the agency to regulate in the public interest. The actual power to shape regulations often rests with the regulated industry. Another divergence occurs in the relationship between public opinion and policy outcomes. The formal theory of representative democracy says that elected officials implement policies that reflect their constituents' preferences. If they don't, constituents vote them out. Research examining this relationship finds that it works that way for some issues and some constituencies, but on economic policy especially, there is essentially zero correlation between what average Americans want and what policies pass. There is a strong correlation between what wealthy Americans and organized business interests want and what policies pass. This holds true regardless of which party controls government. On economic policy, there is essentially zero correlation between what average Americans want and what actually becomes policy. The formal system says elected officials represent constituents. The actual power relationship is that elected officials need money to win elections. Wealthy interests provide that money, and policy tends to reflect the preferences of those providing the money. Representatives formally represent constituents, but their practical dependence runs more toward donors. A third divergence occurs in the judicial system. The Constitution describes courts as interpreting law and resolving disputes. In practice, courts have become major policymakers. They decide which cases to hear, effectively choosing which issues to address. They can strike down laws passed by Democratic majorities, removing issues from Democratic decision-making entirely. They issue rulings that create new legal requirements no legislature passed. They refuse to hear cases challenging certain powers, effectively endorsing those powers through inaction. And they do all of this through lifetime appointees who never face voters. The formal description says courts are the least dangerous branch because they have neither purse nor sword. The actual power courts wield in 2026 rivals or exceeds the other branches on many issues. The Supreme Court's conservative supermajority has rewritten major areas of law on abortion, guns, voting rights, administrative power, campaign finance, and religious liberty without any democratic input beyond the initial appointment and confirmation process. So here's the crucial point. You can accurately understand the entire formal structure of American government and still have little understanding of how outcomes actually get determined. You can know that Congress passes laws, but if you don't know that lobbyists write much of the legislative language, that party leadership decides what gets voted on, that donors influence which bills get serious consideration, that media attention shapes what's politically possible, and that implementation depends on bureaucrats and judges who may have different priorities than legislators, then you don't understand how policy actually gets made. You can know that the president is commander-in-chief and head of the executive branch, But if you don't know that career bureaucrats can resist presidential priorities, that agencies have been captured by industries they regulate, that congressional committees can block presidential nominees, that federal courts can halt executive actions, and that the president's actual control over the sprawling executive branch is limited and contested, then you don't understand how executive power actually works. You can know that judges interpret law, but if you don't know that judicial appointments are the result of multi-decade political projects by ideological movements, that cases are brought strategically to create opportunities for desired rulings, that judges often impose their policy preferences through creative interpretation, and that judicial decisions can override democratic majorities with no recourse except the nearly impossible constitutional amendment process, then you don't understand how judicial power actually works. The civics class version of government is not wrong, it's incomplete, dangerously incomplete. It's like being given a map of a city's major highways and being told, this is how to navigate the city. The highways exist, they matter, but most of life happens on side streets, in neighborhoods, through informal networks. Someone relying only on the highway map will get hopelessly lost trying to actually navigate the city. Now, the Constitution is remarkably short. It leaves enormous questions unanswered. How do political parties work? Nothing in the Constitution mentions them. How do candidates get on the ballot? Not specified. How should campaigns be funded? Not addressed. What happens when informal norms break down? No mechanism provided. These gaps are filled over time by practice, legislation, court decisions, and informal rules. The formal structure provided a skeleton. Informal power added muscle, organs, and a nervous system. Consider political parties. The Constitution doesn't mention them. The founders generally oppose them. Yet parties quickly became the central organizing force in American politics. They decide who can realistically run for office. They control ballot access. They organize legislative activity. They structure voter choice. They fundraise and spend billions. They build ideological coalitions. They enforce discipline. They are arguably the most powerful political institutions in America, and they exist almost entirely outside the constitutional framework. Or consider the modern presidential primary system. Nothing in the Constitution requires primaries. States could choose convention delegates as they want. The current system, where Iowa and New Hampshire go first and exert disproportionate influence, exists purely by informal tradition. Attempts to change it face resistance not because of any legal requirement, but because those states and the political actors who benefit from the current system have enough power to maintain it. Or consider the filibuster in the Senate. This is not in the Constitution. It's a Senate rule that can be changed by a simple majority, yet it has blocked enormous amounts of legislation over decades. It exists purely as an informal norm, one that both parties denounce when out of power and defend when in power because each party values the ability to obstruct more than the ability to govern. These informal arrangements become extremely powerful precisely because they're informal. They're harder to challenge, harder to change, harder even to see clearly. When everything is functioning through unwritten rules and informal power, accountability becomes nearly impossible. Who do you vote out when the problem is the system itself? Here's where things get tricky. Is the American political system broken or working as intended? The answer depends on your frame of reference. If your frame of reference is the civics class story about representative democracy, where majority preferences translate into policy, then yes, the system is broken. It's not producing that outcome. But if your frame of reference is the actual design of the American system, with its many veto points, its protection of minority interests, especially property interests, its emphasis on stability over responsiveness, and its susceptibility to capture by organized factions, then the system is working more or less as designed. The founders did not create a pure democracy. They created a republic with strong protections against what they called tyranny of the majority. They were particularly concerned about democratic majorities threatening property rights. So they built in veto points, supermajority requirements, separation of powers, federalism, and an electoral system that overrepresents rural areas and small states. Many of the features that frustrate modern Americans trying to pass popular policies are features the founders would have considered successes. The system is hard to move. That's a bug from a democratic standpoint, but a feature from a stability and property protection standpoint. What has changed is that the system designed in 1787 for a small agricultural republic now governs a massive industrialized democracy with concentrated economic power, instant global communication, and challenges the founders never imagined. The gaps between formal and informal power have widened. The ability of organized minorities to block majority preferences has increased. The influence of money has exploded. The consequences of gridlock have become more severe. But much of what people experience as dysfunction is actually the system working as it was designed to work, just in a context the designers never anticipated and serving interests they may not have intended to empower. This matters for strategy. If the system is broken, you fix it. If the system is working as designed but producing outcomes you oppose, you need to change the design itself. The latter is much harder. When the gap between formal process and actual outcomes grows too wide, legitimacy erodes. People are told their vote matters. They vote. Nothing changes. They're told to contact their representatives. They do. Policy does the other way. They're told the system is democratic. They watch policy after policy pass over public opposition. At some point, people stop believing the story. They see the formal system continuing while the actual power system operates separately. This creates a legitimacy crisis. Some people respond with cynicism and withdrawal. Why participate in a rigged system? Some respond with anger and support for politicians who promise to tear the system down. Some respond by looking for alternative sources of power outside the formal system. The danger is that when formal democratic institutions lose legitimacy, people look elsewhere for solutions. Sometimes this means productive organizing and movement building. Sometimes it means embracing strongman leaders who promise to bypass the broken system. Sometimes it means political violence. The gap between what government is supposed to do and what power actually does is not just an academic distinction, it's a threat to democratic stability. Understanding the difference between government and power is not just theoretical. It determines whether your efforts to create change will be effective or wasted. If you think government and power are the same thing, you will use the wrong strategies. You'll focus on elections and assume winning elections means controlling power. You'll contact representatives and assume they respond primarily to constituent preferences. You'll expect the formal process to produce outcomes matching its stated purpose. You will be repeatedly disappointed and you won't understand why. If you understand that government and power are different, your strategies change. You still participate in elections, but you recognize them as one moment in a longer process. You still contact representatives, but you understand their behavior is shaped by multiple pressures, and you organize collectively to become one of those pressures. You study where power actually resides and focus your efforts there. You understand that changing who holds office without changing the structures that channel their behavior produces minimal change. You recognize that power often operates preventatively, keeping issues off the agenda entirely. You see that informal power must be challenged with organized counterpower, not just electoral participation. Most importantly, you stop blaming yourself or your fellow citizens for the gap between preferences and policies. The gap is structural. It's the difference between what government says it does and what power actually does. Let me give you a final example that ties all this together. Healthcare reform. For decades, polls have shown that majorities support some form of universal healthcare or a public option. The formal democratic process should translate this preference into policy. It has not. Why? The civics class answer would be that Americans haven't elected the right representatives, or that the policy is too complicated, or that there is genuine disagreement about the best approach. The power answer looks different. The healthcare industry, insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, hospital chains, medical device manufacturers, makes enormous profits from the current system. They have spent billions on lobbying, campaign contributions, and advertising to prevent reform. They fund think tanks that produce research opposing reform. They employ former government officials who maintain relationships with current officials. They threaten job losses in key districts. They frame reform as socialism or government overreach. They write alternative legislation that appears to address problems while protecting their profits. When the Affordable Care Act passed, it was the product of intense negotiation with these industries. The pharmaceutical industry got a promise that the government would not negotiate drug prices. The insurance industry got a mandate requiring people to buy their product. The public option that majority supported was abandoned. The formal process worked. Congress passed a law. But the actual power to determine what was in that law resided as much with healthcare industry lobbyists as with elected representatives. Understanding this doesn't require conspiracy thinking. These industries are protecting their interests using legal tools available to them. They are exercising power. The formal system gives them enormous opportunities to do so. If you want different healthcare policy, you need to counter that power. Electing different representatives might help, but only if you also address the structural advantages the healthcare industry has in shaping policy. Otherwise, different representatives will face the same pressures and constraints that shape their predecessors' behavior. This is the difference between understanding government and understanding power. Government is the arena. Power determines outcomes within that arena. You need to understand both to be effective. So what does this mean for democratic participation? The gap between government and power means that democratic participation must operate on multiple levels. You need to participate in the formal system, vote, contact representatives, testify at hearings, use the official channels. These matter, and sometimes they are sufficient. But you also need to engage with the informal system, organize collective power, build movements, apply economic pressure, shape narratives, create political costs for those who ignore public preferences, challenge the structures that channel power away from democratic accountability. Most people have been taught only about the formal system. They're given incomplete maps and then blamed when they get lost. Understanding that government and power are not the same thing is the beginning of more strategic, more effective engagement. Because once you see that government and power are different things, the next question becomes obvious. If power operates through informal channels as much as formal ones, why are Americans taught that voting is the primary or even sole form of meaningful participation? Why is the message always just vote? Why has political participation been deliberately narrowed to this one act? And what forms of power does that narrowing exclude? The answer to that question reveals even more about how power prefers to operate. But that's a conversation for another episode. Thanks for listening. If this reframed how you think about politics, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And I'll see you next time.